Okay, well, welcome everyone to this first in the autumn series of Heart to Heart. We had a little break for the summer. Hope that you all got some rest, and no doubt you are back in the thick of things in your respective school contexts. I'm Kyra Kellerwan of Women Ed Spain, and with my co-presenter Angeline Au of Women Ed Germany, we are very, very proud and pleased to welcome our special guest, Pauline O'Brien. Pauline is going to be running us through several in a series. It's a new series she's offered us on for aspiring and existing leaders in education. And this first session is on communicating our professional identity and landing our next leadership role. So we're going to have a bit of Pauline's story and lots of practical tips as well from her considerable experience working in leadership selection and recruitment for international school services and other organizations. So with no further ado, I'm going to move forward to our next slide. So Angeline always does a much better job than I do of explaining how this series came about and also what its purpose is. So I'm going to hand over to Angeline, who can introduce the series.
Oh, okay. I'll try my best. So Women Ed, a lot of you are familiar and belong to a group from Women Ed somewhere in your local community. And it really started as a grassroots organization. A few women on Twitter started chatting with each other with the hashtag Women Ed and talking about the challenges they were having in their schools and in education with being a women leader or being an aspiring leader. And so eventually these inspirational women got together and then formed what has now grown into an organization that has 30 different networks across the globe. And there are many events such as this one, the Heart to Heart series, and that is also coming up. And there are also not just live events. There's going to be a big unconference this weekend, but there were also face-to-face events before we had our COVID-19 situation, where a lot of women would get together in schools and they would talk about and bring clarity to a lot of issues with being a woman in leadership or being a female teacher, and then supporting each other so that we have the best talent that rises in schools in order to support our students. And so, yeah, so thank you. Yeah, tell us which Women Ed network you belong to and which one you're coming in. Share with us in the chat. And thank you very much for joining us. When we went into lockdown, Kyra and myself had a chance to meet with each other. I'm from Women Ed DE in Germany, and Kyra is from Women Ed Spain, and a lot of our events got cancelled, and so we decided to go online, and this is how we started the Heart to Heart series, and which we are excited to bring you a new series this academic year as well. So back over to you.
Thank you for that intro. Yes, I just think it's a nice little story that we tell about how this has grown beyond our 2 regional networks and now incorporates people from all over the world, which is fabulous. Thank you to all of those of you from the various Women Ed groups. Northern Ireland is here, and another Germany member, and I'm sure we'll have other potential future participants in Women Ed. So that's great. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Obviously, we're in a webinar today. We can't hear what you're saying, but we do want you to use the chat and the Q&A function. You can post burning questions in there. You can also reply to all of us so that we can all see your questions. And periodically, we'll be stopping to ask you to reflect on some things as well to help us direct the flow of conversation. We want these sessions to be conversational in nature, but of course, we also recognize that it's easier sometimes to keep on message when we are not muting and unmuting ourselves. So we'll try and give you an overview and then ask you lots of questions. So please do get involved. This session is being recorded, so if you know that someone would have liked to have joined us but they can't, feel free to share the link with them that I've posted at the end of the presentation that links to the Women Ed Leaders YouTube channel. And you can also find it again on Twitter, so we will be retweeting it after the fact, either from the Women Ed DE or the Women Ed España handles. You can also reach us via the links below as well. You can at us during, if there's something that resonates with you. We'll be happy to keep that conversation going later on Twitter as well. So with no further ado, I want to introduce Pauline formally and welcome her and thank her for giving up her time and giving us some of her expertise to share. Pauline has been attending the Heart to Hearts, I think, since the very first one. She has been a loyal follower of our activity and has been a valued contributor from afar. And now we're very, very happy that she's agreed to give us some of her time and share with us her story. So currently she's the Director of Administrative Searches and Governance Services at ISS. This role was new this year. Prior to that, she was the former Director of Career and Recruitment Services at the Council of International Schools and supported women's initiatives throughout her career history, but I began to know of her and her involvement and interest in women ed while she was at CIS. She's developed a long and wide range of career initiatives over her career. She wanted us to be able to definitely mention to those of you from the US that she supports the ISS Marianne Haas Symposium for Women Leaders, and she has served on the International Task Force for Child Protection. So as I mentioned before, she's been a long-time advocate for women ed. She's been following and watching from the wings, and now we're delighted to be able to have her share her vision, her story, and to help you practically with some steps to be able to go for that next role, or indeed identify the factors that maybe are preventing you from sharing your own personal brand, or even knowing how to do that. So thank you very much, Pauline. Lovely to have you here.
You're welcome. What an introduction. When I hear the 20+ year career, I'm thinking, where did that go? As I was prepping for today, I was writing out some notes for myself on my career, and then I realized, gosh, I'm over half a century old now, so I guess I should have reached some form of career at this stage. But I'd like to extend a personal welcome to everybody as well. Great that you're taking time out to come and listen to stories, because I think with stories is how we learn, isn't it? It's how we gain insights into others, how others have done things, and maybe we can take one piece of information with us that we can use in our next steps as we take that next step, whether it's a team lead role or a leadership role, or just taking on leadership of a project, whatever that is. I'd also like to just send huge congratulations to everyone actually who's dealing with COVID right now, but in particular to educators, if I may. I am absolutely blown away by the resilience I'm seeing within our community all around the world. I get still to travel around the world from my, behind my screen every day, and I'm learning and listening to all the innovative ways that people are dealing with COVID in schools, how they're offering blended learning, how they're offering online, and hybrid models, and how everyone is just quite tired, but really continuing to support our students. So a real call out to all educators for doing that. I think that's quite appropriate. So yeah, my story. I hope that by the end of this story, you'll start to understand my brand, or get a sense of who I am and how I've built my own brand. When I grew up, we would never have talked about something like a brand. So that's new terminology that I think we all have to get used to and feel comfortable using. But it is certainly a thing of now, that it is something we have to be busy with and to know what our brand is. So I grew up with really strong Irish women around me who instilled values in me that are core to me actually today. We didn't talk about values when I was growing up. They were just kinds of expectations, things I simply had to do. I was encouraged to be strong, to be courageous, to always work hard, to be patient and kind, to show compassion and care for all. I was told to be respectful. I was told to be a good Catholic. I was told to not be big-headed. And I was told to not take myself seriously. So there's a lot there, isn't there, really, to take in. So a lot was expected of me, but it was actually not really that explicit. I took all of this to heart actually as a child and worked really hard at school. I achieved well. I played competitive sports and coached a team. I sang in the folk group at Mass. I worked hard in my mother's small business where I discovered my entrepreneurial skills. I was courageous and at 18 embarked on a gap year, unheard of to anyone in my family at that time, and left the island to explore the world. I'm still on that gap year because I've never actually returned. I secured a position as a nanny with the Irish diplomats in the Netherlands for my gap year, and I learned a lot about diplomatic matters and had the privilege of moving in these circles. And the family I was with always included me in everything they did. My female boss at the time really encouraged me in developing my skills. So I actually ran that household where a lot of entertaining was done with high dignitaries and excellencies crossing our floor every day. I was encouraged to do new things like cook meals I'd never heard of, and travel to countries I've never been to. And at the same time, she encouraged me to learn the Dutch language. At the end of that year, with all these new skills, I was encouraged by this strong female, and I was about to return to Ireland to take up my studies. And so I decided to earn some cash because I was going to be a poor student when I went to Ireland. And I went to work for an international firm to do some temporary work. While at that firm, I got invited to a party and I met my husband. And basically the rest is history. I've been in the Netherlands for 32 years now, and we have two amazing, accomplished daughters in the bargain. So choosing to stay in the Netherlands, much to my parents' dismay, I will say initially, the conditions were that I still needed to do something in education and continue along that path. So I signed up for a study in business, marketing and management in the Dutch language, and then worked during the day. I secured a position, an entry position at an international firm in The Hague, Pharmaceutical International Federation, and I worked incredibly hard during the day, studied diligently in the evenings. I was noticed at that time by a powerful female in this organization who quickly secured me for her department, which was the first global role I secured. I have to say I was ecstatic, to the least, because here was an opportunity that I was certainly going to grab. I was hugely grateful for this opportunity, and I started to travel the first time around the world, having these wonderful experiences. My leadership career truly started here as I was promoted from one role to the other. I actually always thought it was because I worked hard and got the job done. But I realized later that it was because I was building my skill set and my competencies and my expertise that people wanted me to be involved in their projects. I also started to realize that actually people recognized that I was reliable, intuitive, I understood the bigger picture, and these were skills and competencies that people wanted on their teams. So then we had the privilege of our first child arriving, and it was a huge time of reflection for me. Should I stay at home and be a mum, as was common in the Netherlands in those days? Or should I stay working like my mum had done, actually? It was a dilemma, and in the end I realized, for me, I felt it would be better that if I continued along my career path, that I would be a better and more happy mum, being able to share my career path with my daughter and setting an example for her. I didn't want to travel abroad so much at that time because I had a small baby, so I went to a recruitment agency in the Netherlands to ask them to find a position for me. Actually, they offered me a position just as I was interviewing, and they asked me to open a branch office of their recruitment agency here in the Netherlands. And so my next path in my corporate career began. For 13 years, I served this recruitment agency in the capacity of regional manager, regional director, and operations director, and ran a lot of training programs, recruitment programs, did a lot of business development, worked on strategy, worked on talent management, lots of different areas to really look at, the portfolio of a talented, skilled worker, no matter what industry they were in. 13 years there, the magic number. I decided that I really wanted my efforts and my skills to be put to better use and to have bigger impact in the world. I felt corporate industry at that time was not for me. I wanted to to have impact. And I thought, I saw the role at CIS come up, and it was talking about refreshing and changing the scope of how recruitment is done in international education. And I thought, well, that's actually me. I should go for that. Now, I must say that the qualifications that were advertised at the time, I did not meet. But the skill set, the competencies, and the job description, I ticked all the boxes. And so I went for it. I said, I've got nothing to lose, let me go for this. And as you know, I've enjoyed a wonderful 6 years at CIS. As some of you will know, earlier this year, sadly, CIS decided to discontinue its recruitment service. And so I was very lucky to have the fortune to join ISS and be able to continue work in this arena, be able to continue to guide those looking for leadership roles, whether it's aspiring to be heads of schools, principals, or, as I said, leading teachers or just leading projects. You know, I'm really happy to be continuing in this world. That's my story so far. I hope that resonates with some of you as you think about the various experiences you've had along the way. Mine has certainly been hugely interesting and hugely fulfilling, with ups and downs along the way, and we'll talk about that a little later in this session. But for now, that's to date.
That's you in a nutshell. Well,
yeah.
Thank you very much for a very complete story. And I think we agreed when we were going through this, it would be really lovely to hear about your journey. And also, like you said, to talk about some of those moments that perhaps weren't as easy, and some of the things that came up as I was listening were definitely about aspects that we'll address, including, you know, when should you go for a job, even if you don't meet the criteria, etc. So I'd like to move on by asking a question before we sort of show off the first talking point we're gonna cover, and that's a question for the audience members. So we'd like you to type in your answers, if you can, into the chat. I'm going to ask you what you think personal brand is and why it might be necessary. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that question. What is personal brand? Why is it needed? And we're specifically interested in your thoughts and ideas as educators. So hopefully there's some typing going around, along in the background. Pauline, I know you're going to introduce us in a moment to the concept of personal brand, why it's needed. Perhaps you can just say a few things about your experience with educators and the terminology that we're using.
Yeah, I find educators hugely humble in their approach and hugely uncomfortable about talking about achievements and accomplishments. If you start to talk about curriculum or anything that goes on in the classroom, educators can keep you engaged for a long time. When you start to talk about, but what was your impact in the classroom, or what did you do to drive the excellence that was going on, then there's a pause. It's, how do I talk about that? Mm-hmm. People don't want to boast. People don't want to be overconfident. People don't want to appear arrogant or too self-confident. And these are some of the blocks we find, and we'll talk about that later, but these are some of the blocks I find that people just don't know how to articulate what it is they want to say. And I often come across this with lots of leaders, male and female, as I do my job recruiting for leadership roles. And I'm sure, I see that Bridget has joined us, Bridget McNamee, who's coaching a lot of women at the moment with her company, and I'm sure she comes across this all the time as well. You know, how do we boost the vocabulary and feel comfortable about what we're saying?
Well, we've had some ideas coming in through the chat, so that there's a few different ideas there about whether personal brand is how you promote yourself, and that it's not easy, that it's a way of expressing your purpose. Similarly, your personal and professional values and what you are prepared to do or stand up for. I like that answer because it infers some action, some activity needed to create this and shape this. So thank you for those ideas, everyone. So maybe we'll move into what it actually is for you, Pauline.
Yeah, So your brand is who you are, and indeed what you stand for, your values and how you talk about them. And hopefully in my story there, you could see the things that were instilled in me and that I also thought and think are really important, you could see coming through. I think what I've learned is that your brand is your story, your strengths and your reputation and your attributes. So not necessarily what somebody else thinks about you, not necessarily how someone else thinks you should be, but actually it's all about you. So how do you feel comfortable in building your brand? And what I've learned now, looking back, is that you have a brand all the time. You don't have to wait to be in a leadership role to have a brand. Whatever position you're in at this point has a brand, and it's whatever you're doing at that point. And then when you get to the ripe old age that I am, you know, you build on those experiences and your brand can change as you go forward in your career as well. But it's about starting and feeling comfortable, because when you feel comfortable speaking about it, then it becomes real, doesn't it? And then people believe you, and you start to have people, you know, recognize your brand because you decide it and not somebody else. That was your quote, wasn't it, Kyra, from Obama? Fantastic. Yeah, if you don't get out there and define yourself, you'll be quickly and inaccurately defined by others. I think we can all relate to that. You know, how often have we been branded inaccurately? I know I have, for sure. And I didn't always know what to do around that. And I think I fought someone else's perception, or tried to change someone else's perception about me, rather than concentrating on what I think about me and what my brand is. So if there's any piece of my learning I can share, is the sooner everyone does this, the better, because then you feel confident and you feel comfortable in your brand.
Indeed. Yes.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think, you know, the reason that Michelle Obama came to mind, I mean, as so often with talks about being confident and being proud of who you are, I just think we were talking, weren't we, about feeling like you have to fit the job description, feeling like you have to be perfectly suited to a role, and trying to sort of mold yourself around a job, whether that's because you're applying for it in a time where you're, you know, really in need of a change, or you really need to earn more money, or you're desperate to join the school, or whatever it might be, but that you try and mold yourself into the shape that you think the job is. And actually we started looking at it from the other perspective, which is, well, you know, would any of the women that we respect as leaders do that? And the answer is no. They go in knowing that that's the job for them because of who they are. So that's what made me think of Michelle. She's always got quotes that cover almost any concept we're talking about.
You raise such an important point, and I think that's where our mind shift has to be in determining our brand. You know, not making a company mold you, but you choosing the company or the school or the department that you want to work in, because you bring something to that role because of your brand, which encompasses all of this. It's not just your story. It is clearly, we're going from the premise that people have built a skill set, that they're good at whatever they're doing. You know, we are saying that as well, that you are confident and competent in what you do, and how you articulate that is the brand. Often people don't think about, you know, the impact they're having on their environment, on, you know, on student learning, let's say. Teachers expect themselves to have impact on student learning. It's their job to have good classroom management skills. It's their job to do everything that they're supposed to do within, you know, getting a student from A to B in a piece of curriculum, let's say. However, the way they do that, the experience the student has, the relationships that teacher builds with students, with families, with community, that's the personal brand, because it's, you know, a maker or a breaker. I think we can all remember those teachers who really had impact on us, and, you know, who really made that difference. If I look back, I wish there'd been more teachers, and that's also, you know, part of my my overall big picture is, if I can encourage teachers to do better at that, so that they get recognized for their brand, then that's something that I'm happy to contribute to.
Yes, so you touched on a couple of points there that I think we can expand on, and one of them is about figuring out what motivates you, what gives you energy, and what drains it from you. And I know that you wanted to cover that, but I think let's go back to the point that Liz has just commented on, which is about the great misconception of having to meet the job spec 100%. And Liz has said here that she's never come across anyone who's been appointed with 100% of the job spec. It doesn't happen. And when recruiting, she finds someone brings something to enhance your existing thinking. So that's about having an open mindset, of course, when you are hiring. But how important is it to match the job spec, and how much do you prospect as you're looking at candidates?
From my perspective, a job spec is the biggest wish list an employer and hiring manager has. So we pile on there because we have an opportunity to look at what skills and competencies are out there now. So we have this huge wish list of all the things that we want to have, and I'm sure all of us in our time have seen endless tasks that are required, or endless duties that we would be required to do. Hopefully now you're seeing a shift in international education through work that we would have done at CIS, that I know School Spot is continuing to work, and I know Alison is with us today, to look around skills and competencies. So as we educate leaders to write better job descriptions that really talk about skills, competencies, and attributes rather than a list of tasks, because of course, depending on the context you're coming from, will depend whether you've had to carry out those tasks or not. If you're in a school in China concentrating on X, you might go to a school in Africa who doesn't even have that. Let's even think of curriculum. You may work in an IB school in China and then go to a British curriculum in Africa. So those curriculum pieces, while it's important to mention understanding of a curriculum, even if you haven't worked in it, you have ideas of curriculum. You may have done amazing developmental work in a curriculum, and that contribution might be really valuable in another school, for you to bring that perspective to the school. So it's always about, I advise people to look at a job description. If you don't cross off half of it, then you might want to ask yourself if it's the right job, or if you're stretching yourself too much by thinking you could do it all. But if, there's a couple of things that you think, well, I do know a lot of the theory, or I'm able to talk about it, but I just haven't done it. I'd say, okay, what would you bring to the table that could help? What transferable skills will you bring that you do have, rather than focusing on what you don't have? And Liz is totally right. A female trait is that if we don't cross off, at least 95% of those boxes, we are not going to go and apply for that job. Whereas men tend to, the stats are from the National Association of Independent Schools in the US, 50%, if men see 50% of the job description that they can do that, they apply for the role. They also went on to say that because of that, men don't stay as long in their roles as women, because women choose more cautiously and carefully.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, those are interesting facts, I think, as well. And do you think, Pauline, that has to do with being confident, or is it competence, or is it a combination of both? Because one of the Women Ed's 8 C's is about being confident. And so when we look at a job description, do we need to be more, feel more empowered and feel more confident to apply for roles, or is it, or perhaps it's as one of the famous people are saying that men perhaps are thinking that they're more competent than they are. So is it actually our judgments and our perceptions of what that is? So what do you think that is, Pauline?
My experience is that it's both. We do need to recognize our competence first. We need to acknowledge it with ourselves. What are our competencies? What are our skills? And acknowledge them and know them. And then we need to be confident in talking about them. And in general, yeah, I think I've been seeing some things go around on internet from the female lead that have been saying female leaders have been doing a better job leading their countries through COVID than male. And that's not a dig on male, it's just we think about things differently. We have broader perspective sometimes, which is helpful a lot of the time. It can also be unhelpful. You know, we need both skill sets. We need both male and female perspectives in workplaces, from my perspective. But I do believe that we have to start by being confident, and often confidence is seen as being forceful, or I think words like bossy are used, or too straightforward or too direct. And often, even if we're using the same languages as our male counterparts use, we are seen in that way. I saw a study was done by Harvard University some years ago, and they had two actors play out a role. They were applying for a role, and the two actors had exactly the same text, exactly the same answers, and it was one male and one female. Maybe some of the participants have actually seen this. And they had a panel judging these two applicants for the role, and the applicants were made up of male and female. And it was amazing to see afterwards that the females were actually using terms like, this female candidate was bossy, this female candidate was too confident, this female candidate was too pushy. So I think we've got to start to learn language and start to recognize in each other as females, supporting each other. You know, how do we speak in a way that doesn't put somebody else off? Just this week, I was asked by a male colleague if I felt a female was too forceful. And I asked him, can you explain to me what's forceful? What have you experienced as forceful? And when he described it, it was basically that this lady knows her stuff, is not afraid to come out and talk about it, and is really confident in her skills and in her demeanor. And that's the point I think we have to get to. We have to continue to pave a way to call things out at times as well. Call things out in settings where we may be called out by men or women who are not seeing that actually we're just, you know, being as confident, as factual, as to the point as our male counterparts might be.
So I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which was about figuring out who we are, why it's important, you know, to go back to the branding issue, but also to connect to that uncomfortableness about representing our brand. So, you know, obviously it's important to understand how we create one and how we embody one, but then we're also perhaps limiting sometimes ourselves in terms of how we are communicating that. What ideas or what concepts would you have to help us figure out how to understand what our motivations are, put that together into our branding for ourselves, and then communicate that in a way which is not going to detract from what we really can bring?
I think some tips are to, you know, we all know ourselves pretty well. We know what energizes us. We know what sucks our energy. We know what we concentrate on first when we got down to doing the job we need to do, and we know the things that we leave behind us. So I think it's always a case of really being honest with yourself. What am I really good at? And in what setting do I thrive? Where's my passion coming out? Where can people feel that? And establishing that, and then looking for evidence in our careers of when we've done that and when we've been the best at doing that. Often when I'm interviewing people, when I say, tell me about, you know, your position in Munich, let's say, and then the position thereafter was in the States, wherever it was, I can often see, depending on how people start to talk about each role, how much they enjoyed it and how much of their skills and competencies were shown in each role. So it's really looking at, okay, how, you know, what are the things I do really well, and because we need evidence to convince ourselves almost, don't we, that we did do it well. And once we have that evidence, looking for language that helps us describe ourselves, helps us describe our skills, helps us show the evidence we have to highlight our accomplishments, to highlight our achievements, and therefore to define our value.
And you had some practical ideas about an evidence-based approach. So how to actually communicate for educators their impact in the classroom, because in your experience, you've seen and noticed that that can be difficult, or that there's a there's sort of guardedness, maybe, or a shyness even, about the impact that students have felt. How can we organize our CVs in a practical way? How can we organize our language to be able to use more evidence-based?
I think first step is to look at skills. You know, at the top of every CV now, I'd like to see people's skills. Who are they? What do they stand for? And that doesn't have to be pros. They are just key skills that you are, you know, really convinced of for yourself and feel comfortable putting there. Secondly, I'd like to see not just a list of tasks on CVs, but a list of accomplishments as well. So if you are, you know, a grade 5 teacher, for instance, most people know what a grade 5 teacher are doing if you're hiring for a grade 5 teacher. And the leaders I've spoken to don't necessarily want to know what a grade 5 teacher does. They want to know how you do it and the impact you make in the classroom. So how do you turn that list of tasks into actions and results, if you were? So describing something that could, you know, I led student learning around a topic X is usually what I say, what I see. So how do you turn that into something like, I led student learning with a class of 35 students, resulting in the average grade of student learning increasing by 2%. And I did this by giving students ownership of their learning, or whatever that is. I'm just trying to throw out some examples there to give you an idea of how you turn that around from a task to an action and then a result. Does that answer a little bit of what you're at, Kyra?
It does, thank you. Sorry, I'd gone forward one slide too many. So moving into that more practical skills-based area, I think we wanted to ask the audience a question just to see how we sort of frame the conversation next. So Angeline, I think we have a poll ready.
Yeah.
Angeline's
yes, we do. I'm going to launch the poll. And so we wanted to find out about what are your experiences? What are possibly some blockers that you've had in doing all these things that Pauline has said? Is it imposter syndrome? Is it feeling like, oh, that's maybe not just me? Can I really do that? Was it the glass ceiling that you felt, you know, you were there was a block for you to aspire towards the next leadership position? Sexism at work, lack of school resources. Resources could be PD, perhaps, or was it other blockers? And if you choose other blockers, maybe you'd like to just add into the chat some other factors that you felt, you know, blocked you from either finding your own brand or applying for the new position, and surrounding this topic that we have today.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, the results that are coming in already. So imposter syndrome is winning, but we have a lot of others as well. So we hope that you'll share those others with us so that we understand what they could be. So Pauline, why don't we start with imposter syndrome then, as that seems to be the big unspoken one.
Yeah, I think I think it goes back to leadership roles or leading roles are typified to be male-dominated roles, and so it's hard for us to think that we can take the lead, because we expect to see male heads of schools, parents expect to see, or I don't want to generalize too much now, because of course it's different where you are, but it traditionally, I think, the leadership role was given to male, and weird. This is why this whole Women Ed is set up for us, right, to change that and to make steps in changing that. But the imposter syndrome, I think, there's a book by Joan Williams called What Women Want at Work. And she talks about the biases that women have to deal with as they, she's done some extensive research on the things women have faced at work, the glass ceiling, the tightrope, what does she call it, the maternal wall, and the imposter syndrome is I think relates to that, because we always seem we have to prove it again, and that's why we feel imposters sometimes. We have to prove it again and again and again. I read something recently that said, when men make mistakes, they're just mistakes. When women make mistakes, they're deemed incompetent. And so again, it's around our demeanor. How do we ooze confidence and be fine with making a mistake, rather than believing ourselves that we're incompetent at that time?
I was just thinking about that this morning when I woke up and I watched the presidential debate, and I was thinking, wow, when we saw how Hillary handled the last one, I'm trying not to show my colours, although I clearly am, but I just thought, wow, she really had no recognition of how difficult it is to debate with President Trump, and yes, it really shone that we would judge her much more harshly than we would have anyone else who was faced with the same issues. So the other blockers that came in were things like age, which I think is an important one to consider, and having a job title that is a well-known title in the field, but doesn't really convey what I have done with the role, which I guess is where the personal story and the mission at the top of your CV comes in. So yeah, maybe you can speak a bit to the discrimination aspects of some of those things that feed into imposter syndrome, but also can be other very real blockers that are happening in the background.
Yeah, I think discrimination is broad, isn't it, when we talk about that? And I don't know that we can cover that topic, if I'm honest, in the time we have left here. So maybe we keep that. But discrimination, discrimination in the sense that, not being given an opportunity or not being given a chance, that is certainly the case. In international schools, we all know that it is a heavily networked organization, and people move around quite a bit and follow their leaders if they've done really well, and can get hired at future schools with leaders they've worked with, which is all great. But if that doesn't allow for new talent to come through and give new talent the opportunity, that's where we have to really look at our practices, I think. And I think for me, coming into the international school world all those years ago, I didn't know anyone, and I didn't know many of the schools. And so my viewpoint was very open. And so I really was just looking at experience and skills and competencies as I, try to fulfill these roles. And now I have to watch that myself, my own bias. Now I have to say, okay, watch out, because I do know many more people. I do know many more schools. And so I have to also watch that I'm not discriminating, and that I'm paying attention to my own practice in that. So I think it goes two ways. We've got to be careful.
So once we've gotten into being able to talk about ourselves and our achievements, and gotten past the either inbuilt humility or the fear of being judged, or perhaps some of the external circumstances, in the professional identity piece that we're building, could you lead us down some of the things that you've seen that have really worked for you? I know you started out with the CV and with the highlights, the evidence-based messaging that you talked about earlier, but could you give us any of these tips that maybe have worked for you, or that had real impact on the hiring you've done?
Absolutely. I think to be true to yourself is the first thing, and we've talked a little about that. I want to see people who are real and who are authentic, and who are not just going to tell me what I want to hear, but who are going to just be themselves and be able, to share their experience, share their story, share their values, and also talk honestly about the areas of development that they'd like to see happening in this next position for them. I think it's important. For me, I've been described at times, actually quite often, as being warm and authentic, and now I think that's a good thing. But there was a time in my career that I thought, but am I not professional? And do people not take me seriously? And am I not effective at what I do? So I think it's really looking at all of those things, looking at the softer skills we have, and also those hard skills, you know, that sometimes are talked about in job descriptions. So being able to think about describing both. And I think there's somebody said something about humility in the chat. We can still be humble by talking about what we're doing. I would hate to think I was not humble when going for another job, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to be able to talk about the things I can bring to a role, and the you know, the experiences I've had and the expertise I've gained.
Yes, so you've given us a lovely list here. You've talked about developing documentation for your brand. So
Yeah.
I wonder if you can explain what you mean by that.
So again, thinking about, you know, your CV and your application letters or letters of interest that you want to start setting up. Your CV, I would say, you know, don't just list tasks, as we said. Look for evidence and look for outcomes that you can include in that. And then a lot of times people will say, oh, but then it's going to be too long and I'm going to go on forever. But the whole point is to get the highlights of what makes you different, what makes you different, what are your attributes and makes you stand out when you carry out that role. Letters of application are changing. You know, often we see people using the same application letter for many or multiple roles that they're applying for. To me, then I'm thinking you're not looking at the job description correctly, and you're not looking for the attributes that particular school is seeking. You always need to link your experience to what's being looked for. You always need to make sure that you've referred to that in your letter as well, that you can show evidence to something that they're looking for, that you've had experience in doing that. Examples and samples of work, as I've written, you know, that's really important. People say, oh, do I really need to show that? Well, yes, if you've done some fun projects as a wonderful kindergarten teacher and you've got, you know, children inspired, share it. And the same goes for, you know, if you've been helping solve the biggest maths and science challenges and your students have come up with some amazing project, or you know, there are examples of students being led at this time to be able to do TED Talks in schools. You know, there are teachers, really innovative and creative teachers who are helping that. If that's been part of your work, add that to your portfolio. And your feedback from your appraisals and assessments. This is something I don't see done a lot in schools. Each year, you know, most really good school leaders are setting out a pathway for teachers each year. You know, they agree what they're going to achieve, what they need to achieve for their students, and they're assessed on that throughout the year. That assessment at the end of the year is ideally your journey, and it is the next step you've taken in building your experience, building your competencies, and building skills, you know, and having results as a result of it. And so, you know, that's something to think about, using that as part of, you know, your portfolio as well. I would also seek feedback from colleagues and from leaders. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to do this positive psychology course, and one of the assignments was to get self-reflected feedback from people in my circles. And I learned that some people found it really difficult to send that to, you know, 4 or 5 people. I actually sent it to 30 people because I really wanted to see, and I did it through all walks of my career. So right back when I was an au pair to my CIS days at the time. And that is actually what helped me build my brand, because the questions were asked, it was a positive psychology exercise, as I mentioned, and it was, people were asked, when did they see me at my best? They had to give 3 examples of seeing me at my best. And I thought that was a really powerful way for me to learn, number one, what people thought at that time, the impact it had on them, and then my recollection of it. And it was one of the most joyous exercises, I have to say, I've done for years, because you know, there were things that made me cry, there were things that I thought, oh gosh, I never realized I had that impact. There were other things that really surprised me as well that people wrote, but it was hugely reflective, and I would encourage people to do something similar. And again, in building that positive brand that we need to build, that will help us, because then we'll understand what people see about us, and either we can agree with that and say, yes, I'm happy with that, this is how I see myself as well, or does that person think that about me? I need to do something about that to claim my own brand back, right?
Yes, and I like the way that you've mentioned both very practical elements there of assessment, outcomes and metrics, and explained how to work with those in a way that will show tangible results that can be translated across school systems, but also to think on the soft skills and the things that we've done as humans. And I think one of the things that you said that really resonated with me when we were planning this session out was that leaders have had to be observing the shift in the way that teaching has been delivered in such a wholly unusual way this year, that it's easy to see who seamlessly integrated, who innovated, who was better with the technology, and then who really didn't, who was struggling to keep up. And I think you mentioned something about being honest with yourself in terms of identifying those pain points and those things that perhaps this year really caused you stress, or that caused you to feel out of your depth, because as we know, there were fantastic teachers who found it very difficult to integrate into an online classroom. So how do people sort of go about recognizing that and then doing something to address that is a very important thing that I think we can come back to maybe in the second session. Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to ask for questions coming in, because I know we're a few minutes from the hour, and you've sort of started up what I think is a much bigger conversation there that we can take in different directions. But I'd love to hear from our audience members just to see what's resonated with you, what you would like to have more information about, and any other questions that come to mind as we're about to close the session, because that will help us in our planning. We'd like to have Pauline back at least a couple of times to give us some examples, some more practical examples, and to talk through some of the perhaps evidence-based CVs that she's seen, some examples that have really resonated with her. And we'd like to do that in November, so we'll announce that date in a moment. But if there are any questions that we can take now from the audience, then we're happy to receive those and answer them. Yes, so we have a comment there saying the more practical the better. This is great to hear. So obviously I think next time, perhaps what I'm feeling, and I think what might be useful, is that we see some tangible examples of educator CVs and educator cover letters that have been really, really effective. And I think we can all probably work to send some of those in. Exactly. Yeah, great. So we're planning another session at the end of November. So I think what I'll do there is just flash up our hashtags and our Twitter accounts for you to keep the conversation going, for you to at us, perhaps at Pauline, with some questions or comments or ideas, and that will help us drive the next agenda for the next session so that we can make sure we're covering everything that you need. We will take into account your feedback on the practicalities and the example CVs and covering letters. Thank you so much, Pauline, for sharing that wonderful opening to your career and your story, and also helping us understand some of the first steps we can make in order to start thinking about branding for ourselves. Yeah, you're very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's close to my heart to want to support women in progressing in their careers, and probably because most of my all of my career has been with female leaders, and so I think I've been one of the lucky ones as well, and so anything I can do to support this initiative, I'm happy to do so. That's fantastic. I know we're all hoping we can invite you to one of our in-person events as soon as that's possible. I'm sure Women at Netherlands will be all over that. As I said at the beginning, if anyone would like to share this with a colleague, prepare them for the next session, get their appetites whetted, you can follow the Women Ed YouTube. I've shortened the link there because it's a crazy long link otherwise. And our second edition of this series on career exploration and finding your fit with a leadership role will be on November the 25th, which is another Wednesday, so in a couple of months' time. We hope that you come back and that you are ready to, we'll share the resources with you so that you can put some practical steps into effect. Thank you very much to everyone who attended, and thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Angelina. Thank you, Kyra,
Yes,
for
thank you.
organising this, and thanks everyone indeed for coming.